up to the unsettling events were ordinary enough. James had never been one to overthink things, and yet something had begun to gnaw at the edges of his life. It started innocuously. He was used to his friends calling him by his name, James. After all, they had been friends for years, and there was little room for confusion. But slowly, one by one, they began to call him by a different name. At first, he dismissed it as an honest mistake. Maybe it was just a slip of the tongue. After all, these were people he had known for so long, and there was no reason for them to forget who he was. But the slip-ups became more frequent. His best friend, Mark, called him Alex one day. His co-worker, Sarah, referred to him as Steve. Even his own brother, David, had called him Ben during a phone call. It was subtle, but there it was, creeping into his conversations with increasing regularity. James had never mentioned it to anyone. It was small, and he thought that perhaps he was just imagining it. However, the strange occurrences didn't stop there. One night, while getting ready for bed, James glanced at himself in the bathroom mirror. He reached to adjust his hair, but his reflection did not immediately follow his movements. For a moment it stood still, staring back at him with its cold, lifeless eyes. It took several seconds before his reflection finally responded, mimicking his actions as if it had been momentarily frozen. It was an unsettling experience, but James convinced himself that it was merely a trick of the light or fatigue setting in. After all, he had been under a lot of stress lately. He had been working long hours and dealing with personal issues. So he brushed it off, went to bed, and tried to push the thought from his mind. The next day, however, things took a darker turn. He was walking down the street running errands when he passed a cafe where his friends often gathered. As he entered, they looked at him with expressions that were distant, as though they hadn't seen him in years. They greeted him, but it was off. Unnatural. Mark, who had always been the most jovial of the group, looked at him with a puzzled frown before calling him Michael. "Hey, Michael, have you seen the latest movie?" Mark asked, his voice flat, devoid of the usual warmth. James froze. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about Mark's voice that sent a shiver down his spine. His friends weren't just calling him by the wrong name. They seemed to truly believe that it was his name. "No, I haven't seen it," James replied, his voice uncertain. Mark seemed to accept the answer, though his eyes lingered on James for a moment longer than usual. James quickly left the cafe, his thoughts spinning. What was going on? Why were his friends calling him the wrong name? It was that evening when he was walking home that the reflection incident happened again. This time, it wasn't just a matter of a few seconds delay. As he stood in front of the mirror brushing his teeth, his reflection moved independently of him. It smiled at him, a strange, sinister grin that he did not recognize. James recoiled, dropping his toothbrush in shock. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at his own face, which was still frozen in a look of horror. Yet his reflection seemed to mock him with an expression he had never made before. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. The next few days were a blur of confusion. He tried to talk to his friends about it, but every time he tried to explain what was happening, they looked at him with blank expressions, as if they had no idea what he was talking about. Each encounter left him feeling more alienated and isolated. They were calling him by the wrong name. They were acting as though they didn't even recognize him. And now his reflection was doing things it shouldn't be. He was losing control of his own life. And then, one night, things took a terrifying turn. James woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, his heart racing. He was sweating, his body tense, but there was no apparent reason for it. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. He turned to look at his bedside clock, 2:34 a.m. There was a strange sense of foreboding, something he couldn't shake, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He rolled over to glance at his reflection in the mirror across the room. To his shock, he saw his own face staring back at him. But it wasn't the expression he had just worn a moment ago. It was his face, eyes closed in peaceful sleep. The air seemed to freeze. His heart skipped a beat as he sat up in bed. He felt his throat constricting. His reflection was asleep. His body was still lying in bed, yet his reflection was in a deep, still slumber. And then, as if to mock his fear, the reflection opened its eyes slowly. It stared at him. Cold, empty eyes. It wasn't him anymore. It was something else entirely that had taken his place. He sprang out of bed, desperate to escape the suffocating panic creeping in. But before he could even reach the door, a chill ran down his spine, and he froze in place. He turned slowly toward the window. His reflection was no longer in the mirror across the room. It wasn't even in the room with him anymore. Instead, he saw it standing outside, in the garden, just outside the window, staring at him. He was standing at the edge of the window, his hands pressed against the glass. And he wasn't just standing there. His reflection was looking directly at him, its eyes full of an eerie emptiness that made James's blood run cold. It was as if the reflection knew something James didn't. It was as if the reflection was the one in control now, while James had become nothing more than an observer in his own life. The glass fogged up as James pressed his hands against it. It felt as though something was pressing back on the other side, slowly, inexorably. And then, with a slow and deliberate motion, the reflection smiled. It wasn't the smile of a person. It was the smile of something that had never been human. A shudder ran through him as he backed away from the window. He turned and ran for the door, but the house felt different now, like it was closing in on him. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and the doors, which had always been familiar, now seemed like barriers he couldn't pass through. Every corner he turned, every step he took, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. James could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, faint but distinct. His own footsteps. The reflection was moving in the house. It was following him, mimicking his every move as if it had become an extension of him. But something was wrong. Something far worse than he could comprehend. Because James wasn't the one controlling his own body anymore. His reflection, that lifeless thing, was the one in charge. As the night wore on, James realized that he had become a stranger in his own life. The reflection wasn't just an image in the mirror. It was his true self now. And the real James. He was locked out, staring through the window, watching as his reflection slowly took over the life he had once known. James couldn't understand what was happening. He had spent years working with his hands, fixing problems and navigating life with a practical mindset. But no matter how hard he tried to reason through it, the events unfolding around him defied all logic. The strange occurrences with his reflection were now more than just disturbing. They were a threat, something that seemed to hold a power over him, something he had no control over. The first time he noticed it, he had been standing in his living room, absent-mindedly staring at the wall. He didn't feel sick or tired, but the eerie stillness in the house had begun to weigh on him. It was like he wasn't alone. even when the house was empty. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was just on the edge of his consciousness, watching him, waiting for him to notice. That evening, after a long and frustrating day at work, he passed by the hallway mirror as he walked toward his bedroom. His reflection was blurry, distorted in a way he couldn't explain. He paused, reaching out to touch the cold surface. His reflection didn't immediately mimic his movement. It seemed frozen for a moment, a fraction of a second longer than it should have been. But when it did respond, it didn't feel like his reflection at all. It moved too slowly, as though it were hesitating, unsure of its own actions. James stepped back, unsure of what he had just seen. He shrugged it off as nothing more than the result of fatigue. After all, he had been working non-stop recently. There had been no time for rest, no time to even sit down and reflect on anything for longer than a few minutes. He didn't have the luxury of thinking about things that made him uncomfortable. But now, something told him that the discomfort was growing deeper. Something had changed in him. Something was wrong. The next day, he woke up early and prepared for his usual routine. His reflection, however, seemed to have its own agenda. As James brushed his teeth, his reflection didn't follow his movements. When he lowered the toothbrush, his reflection lingered on the action, as though delayed, as though not sure if it was supposed to do the same thing. His reflection stayed frozen for a brief moment, longer than necessary, as though it were calculating. "Get a grip, James," he muttered under his breath, trying to shake the thought from his mind. But as he looked closer at his reflection, he realized something. There was no expression on the face staring back at him, nothing that resembled the person he had known for years. It was as if the face staring at him was empty, hollow. He felt a cold rush run through his body. It wasn't just his reflection. It was as though he was looking at someone else entirely. Someone who wore his face, but wasn't him. Someone who wasn't human. He couldn't bear it anymore. He grabbed his coat, left his apartment, and went to work, trying desperately to push the thought out of his head. But it didn't work. It never worked. The image of that empty, lifeless face stayed with him the entire day. He found himself distracted during meetings, unable to concentrate, his mind constantly wandering back to that moment in the bathroom. His colleagues asked him if he was okay, but he waved them off with a forced smile, too embarrassed to explain what he had seen. How could he explain something like that? No one would believe him. His friends, too, were acting strangely. It wasn't just the fact that they were calling him by the wrong name. It was how they spoke to him. Their voices lacked warmth, their eyes averted from his gaze. They seemed to speak to him with an unfamiliar air of detachment, like they were talking to a stranger, not someone they had known for years. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table trying to work through the growing sense of unease, something caught his eye out of the corner of his vision. The mirror on the wall, the one he passed by every day without a second thought, seemed to shimmer for a moment, as though disturbed by something unseen. He looked up, his heartbeat quickening. There, in the reflection, he saw it again. The reflection wasn't moving in sync with him. It was lagging behind, always just a fraction of a second behind his own movements. And the most disturbing part, it wasn't mimicking his actions in the same way. His reflection wasn't simply repeating his movements, it was making its own decisions. James reached out to touch the surface of the mirror, his hand trembling. His reflection reached out as well, but it didn't touch the glass in the same way. It lingered there, its fingers pressing lightly against the surface as though trying to push through. He recoiled in shock, His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a hammer. His reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something alive. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to forget the strange events that had unfolded, he heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, echoing footsteps that seemed to come from the hallway outside his bedroom. He froze, his body stiff with fear. The footsteps stopped just outside his door, but he heard nothing more. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The house was still, too still. It was as though the entire world had fallen silent. Then, slowly, cautiously, he turned his head toward the mirror on his dresser. The reflection was there, staring back at him, just as it always had been. But there was something different about it. It wasn't him looking back anymore. It was someone else. The reflection was smiling. It wasn't a smile James recognized. It was a grin that didn't belong on his face. It was wider than anything he could manage, a grotesque mockery of his own smile, full of teeth, too many teeth, jagged and uneven. And in the reflection he saw something even more horrifying. He was still lying in bed, but the reflection was standing. It was standing and grinning, staring directly at him with those wide, empty eyes. The sight made his blood run cold. He quickly pulled the blankets over his head, squeezing his eyes shut, willing the image to go away. But no matter how tightly he shut his eyes, the image lingered. He could still feel the presence of the reflection standing there, watching him. He finally fell into a restless sleep, but when he awoke the next morning, he knew something had changed. His reflection was moving faster now. The delay was still there, but it was barely noticeable. It was like it was trying to keep up with him, struggling to mimic him as he went about his day. But it wasn't just lagging behind. It was growing more independent. James became obsessed with the idea of the reflection. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't ignore it. Every time he passed a mirror, he would find himself pausing, staring at the reflection, watching it, watching himself. Was it really him? Was it really his reflection? Or was it something else entirely? Something that had taken control of his life, of his body. He became more and more isolated. His friends and family noticed his odd behavior, but they didn't seem to understand. They thought he was just stressed, overworked. But James knew better. He knew that something was wrong, something much worse than he could ever explain. And then, one night, it happened. The thing he had feared most. James woke up suddenly, heart racing, unable to breathe. He didn't know what had woken him, only that he was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the feeling, but everything seemed normal, too normal. He turned to the side, glancing toward the mirror across the room. His reflection was there, as usual, mimicking his every movement. But then, something was wrong. His reflection wasn't just moving with him anymore. It wasn't just following his actions. It was watching him. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, his reflection smiled. It wasn't his smile. It was the same grotesque grin he had seen the night before. And in that moment, James realized the truth. He was no longer in control. The reflection had taken over. It was the one controlling his movements now. It was the one in charge. And as James stared back at the mirror, he realized something even more terrifying. He was standing on the other side of the room, watching himself sleep in his own bed. He wasn't in control anymore. His reflection had become the one who lived, while James was nothing more than a prisoner, trapped in the darkness of the glass. James could no longer ignore the truth. His reflection had taken over. The horrific realization gnawed at him deep inside. It wasn't just a mirror image. It wasn't just something that could be brushed off as an illusion. His reflection had become his shadow, the version of him that had grown more real with every passing day, and he was no longer the one in control. His life, the one he had built and lived for years, was no longer his own. The things he had once held dear, the comfort of his home, the friendships he had nurtured, were all slipping away from him, slowly, insidiously. But now, he felt a cold, empty space inside himself that he couldn't fill. He wasn't just losing his reflection, he was losing himself. The reflection, if it could even be called that anymore, was far more than a mirror image now. It was an entity that had evolved, like a parasite feeding off his own essence. At first, it had been content to merely mirror his actions, to mimic his movements. But as time went on, it began to do things differently. It moved with more confidence, with more certainty. It made decisions for him. And James felt weaker, disconnected from his own body, his own life. Every glance in the mirror, every step he took, was accompanied by the horrifying realization that he was no longer in control. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that the reflection seemed to know him better than he knew himself. It had begun to change the way his life unfolded. Every little thing he did, every choice he made, seemed to be subtly altered by that mocking, distorted version of himself. His friends started to avoid him, not because they didn't care, but because the reflection, his reflection, had started to replace him. They greeted it with warmth and familiarity, calling it by the wrong name, calling it something he could never identify with. And they never once acknowledged the man who had once been their friend. The more he resisted, the more the reflection seemed to grow in power. It wasn't just standing in the mirror anymore. It was everywhere. It was in the windows, in the shadows of the rooms, in the corners of the house. It was becoming part of the very fabric of his existence. No matter where he went, it was there, lurking, watching. Even the walls seemed to close in, as though they, too, had been taken over by the presence of the thing he had once been. There were nights when he would wake up, only to find himself staring at his own reflection, standing in front of the mirror, gazing back at him. It was as if he were not even in his own body anymore, just an observer, trapped in the skin of a person he didn't recognize. But every time he tried to move, to speak, to scream out for help, his body wouldn't obey him. The reflection had learned to control it all, every little piece of him, every tiny action. It wasn't even James anymore. It was something else, something that had taken over the life he had once known. The final night came without warning. It was as if the reflection had waited for this moment, for the time when James would be too weak, too powerless to fight back. He stood in the center of his bedroom, staring at the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. His reflection wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It was beyond that. It had a life of its own. It had become more than a mere image. It had become the puppet master. And James, he was the puppet. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of something ancient and powerful. The reflection in the mirror smiled at him, a smile so wide, so grotesque, that it seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. It was no longer the man he had once been. It was something far darker, a version of him that had been twisted and distorted beyond recognition. And as it smiled at him, its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, cold and unfeeling. James took a step back, but his body wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding him in place, anchoring him to the spot. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The reflection was reaching out to him, not through the mirror, but from the very air around him. It was everywhere, closing in on him. And then it happened. The reflection stepped out of the mirror. It wasn't like he had expected. There was no shattering of glass, no violent rupture of the reality he once knew. It was a slow, deliberate process. The reflection didn't simply cross the boundary of the mirror. It slid out of it, as though the glass had been nothing more than a veil, a thin barrier between the world of the living and the thing that had once been him. And as the reflection stepped forward, it felt like the world itself was shifting, like the ground beneath James's feet was no longer stable. The reflection stood before him, towering over him, grinning down at him with those cold, soulless eyes. It was no longer just an image. It was real, more real than anything James had ever known. It was alive, and it was here to take everything from him. James felt a sudden, intense cold wash over him, a cold that seemed to seep into his bones, freezing him in place. He tried to run, to escape, but his body wouldn't obey. It was like being trapped inside a nightmare from which there was no waking up. The reflection reached out, its hand touching his face, and in that moment, James felt it. He felt the connection between them, the link that had always been there, but now it was stronger, more suffocating. It was no longer just a reflection. It was him, and he was nothing more than a shadow. The reflection's smile widened, and James felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of loss. It was as if everything he had once been was being drained away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. He was slipping, falling into the void, losing himself to something that was both him and not him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the reflection let go. James stumbled backward, his legs finally obeying his commands, as he fell to the floor, gasping for air. The room was silent again, eerily silent, as if the world had gone still. He looked up at the mirror, half expecting to see the reflection standing there, waiting for him. But it was gone. For a brief, fleeting moment, he felt a sense of relief. He was alone again, or so he thought. But as he looked around the room, he noticed something that sent a chill through him. The mirror was no longer reflecting the room in front of him. It wasn't reflecting anything at all. It was empty, black, void of any image, as though it had been erased from existence. And then it hit him. The reflection had not just taken over his life. It had erased him from existence. He was nothing more than a whisper in the wind, a fleeting memory that no one would remember. The reflection had become real, and he was left behind, a ghost in his own home. He stumbled to his feet, panic flooding through him. He could feel the walls closing in, the house becoming smaller, more suffocating. The darkness in the mirror stretched, expanding like a growing shadow, and James knew with a sinking certainty that there was no escaping it now. The reflection had won, and in the end, there was nothing left for him but the silence of his own disappearance. And as the last remnants of his consciousness faded into nothingness, he understood the final truth. The reflection had never been a mere image. It had been waiting for him to disappear, so that it could take his place. The last thing he saw was the empty mirror, reflecting nothing, but somehow reflecting everything. And then there was nothing.